Login accepted.
We're going to get started with the final week of the 2023 summer boot camps for CPTC. And this week we're going to be covering the last chapter of the, I guess, roadmap that we set out at the beginning, which is consulting. So again, sign in form. In case you forgot who I was, I am Gabriel. I was here for the web week, and now I'm going to be covering consulting as well. So again, this is our final week of the boot camp before tryouts. So about this time next week, you guys are going to be trying out for the team. It's going to be a pretty exciting time frame, hopefully. But yeah, without further ado, let's get on with it. We're going to start off with why are we talking about business in the first place? Then we're going to jump into professionalism and ethics. We're going to go over communication and how to communicate with a client. And then lastly, we're going to go over the homework/lab. Okay, so first, why business? So the number one thing to note here is that like CTFs and like other like very technical lab exercises such as this boot camp or hack the box or try hack me, etc., are fundamentally focused on teaching you like technical skills, technical things, how things work and stuff like that. And while that is very useful at teaching you like the fundamentals of penetration testing, the methodology, the techniques, and the tooling that you can use, it's only a small part of what a true penetration tester actually does in the real world. Because in the real world, you have to deal with clients and their infrastructure. You have to deal with your own red team infrastructure. You have to sometimes do social engineering or try to bypass antivirus and EDR. And then, you may also have to accomplish specific business objectives that are given to you by the client, as opposed to just going for domain administrative, right? It's very important that when you actually enter like the workforce as a penetration tester, that your goal isn't just to focus on things such as getting DA or things like that, because there's a lot of risks that you may, introduce to the client's, business operation or organization. And as a penetration tester, your goal is to provide value and help the client that hired you, right? So there's a lot of these other things that you're going to have to really, really keep track of in order to be a successful penetration tester. So what is our purpose as penetration testers, as consultants? Well, we are here to help the organizations that have hired us, right? So you can't just say something like, oh, just patch your systems and you'll be fine, right? Because although that is to a technical person the most straightforward approach of how to, handle this, the most important part of being a consultant is that you focus on how to communicate and how to help your client understand what you're telling them and what you found during your engagement, right? So a much better and useful like sentence that you might tell a client is vulnerability X has risks of Y. We suggest A to address X. Other mitigations include B and C. So with this approach, we tell them specifically why the vulnerability X, is a problem, why they need to address it in the first place, and why, if that risk is something that the client is willing to accept, why the mitigations may not be necessary. We give them a suggestion, to address this vulnerability. That's like our number one recommendation. But then we also recognize that not all clients are the same, and that sometimes suggestion A may not apply. So then we also give them other options as are applicable. So this is a much more useful approach to, communicating and trying to help our client. Again, our goal is to try to provide value. And as consultants, we're not technically like permanent hires, right? So we have to make sure that we are communicating with our client because we may not always be there, right? So during the engagement, we should be doing things like working with the security team if stealth is not one of our primary objectives, right? Among other things, we have to focus on what is specifically given to us to focus on as objectives in our request for proposal. And if we ever encounter a situation where we question the scope of our actions, we should always try to seek permission first, or reference our agreed upon contract as how to navigate those situations. So it's very important that we have those kinds of things detailed to us beforehand before we even start, right? And after we finish the engagement, our primary means of communicating with the clients are going to be with reports and with presentations. Those are the two main artifacts that we're going to leave our clients with, and that really is going to represent like the majority of the value that we provide, right? Doesn't matter how many buffer overflows we find. It doesn't matter, how many domain administrators we compromise. If we can't report that, if we can't present that in a way that helps our client understand what they need to do and why it's a problem, then we basically did nothing. So next, we're going to jump into professionalism and ethics. This is something that if you've ever done like Hack the Box, and things like that, you've never really had to deal with really at all. But in CPTC, this is a primary part of the competition. So when you are dealing with clients, there's a lot of business considerations that you have to kind of deal with. We have things like clients, uptime of the services and servers that they are running. We have to focus on what is our objectives and what is our scope. We have to consider the general ethics of what we're doing. Sometimes we may encounter a vulnerability, but it's actually an intended feature. So how do we report that? Is that something we should report at all, or is that going to just kind of, be like muddying what our classifications of vulnerabilities are and confuse our clients? Or we might have to deal with 20-plus-year-old technology that we may not be familiar with, or that may be extremely fragile and delicate, right? So there's a lot of things that we have to consider when, operating as consultants. So if you're dealing with clients, you're obviously focusing on your client interactions, right? You're basically, as a consultant, a service worker, right? Much like how if you were to be working as a server at a restaurant and you have to, greet the client, you have to like, introduce yourself and all that stuff, you very much do the same here, right? You're not going to be a random like person on a computer behind a desk, hacking away, right? You're going to have to interface with your clients, and you're going to have to be presentable. You're going to have to, be like that stereotypical business kind of person who is like super extroverted and stuff like that, right? That provides, a sense of confidence in your abilities to the client, and that's very valuable, right? You're going to have to be able to communicate technical topics to non-technical people. And what that means is that you may have a very thorough understanding of something, and you may like want to communicate those kinds of technical details to the person that you're talking to on the client side, but they may not understand things the same way that you do, or they may not have the same background that you do, right? If you're talking to the CEO of a company, they're not going to know possibly like what a domain even is or what Linux is, right? So you're going to have to try to communicate things to your audience appropriately. If you are talking to someone technical, then you can go into those technical details. But if you're not, you got to kind of be aware of your audience. You're also going to have to be very, very prepared to answer tough questions, right? Generally speaking, when you are, submitting a report, the questions are probably going to come in more of like an email format or something like that. So it's kind of like asynchronous in that sense. But if you just gave a presentation, for example, and they throw you a curveball question that you may not have been expecting, you're going to have to be able to, either answer that question in a way that you are comfortable with and you're confident in, or you may have to defer that question. You may have to say, I'm not 100% of that right now. I know someone who is, or I know where to get that information. Let me get that information to you when I can be more like assured of what the situation is, right? In addition to that, you have to learn how to say no respectfully, right? If the client wants you to do something that you don't think is either possible or you don't think is ethically correct, or maybe it just exceeds what your contract initially stated, and you don't have the resources to go above and beyond, then you have to learn how to say no respectfully, right? You can't just say, no, that's not in the contract, not going to do it, right? You have to learn how to say that with like, if there's not going to be considerations for expanding the so and so part of the contract, then unfortunately, we will be unable to increase our scope, right? You're going to have to try to make sure that these kinds of things are like either written down or just tracked in some way. But it is very important that when you are saying no respectfully, or when you're trying to give technical advice, that the client feels comfortable at all times, because the client is the most important part of consultancy. It's actually not the consultant, because if you don't have clients, you're not going to have, any business as a consultant. You're not going to have any way to make money. So it's very important that you make the customer feel comfortable. Some tough questions may include things like, can you perform penetration tests during off hours? The client may want to do this because they want to either avoid having some kind of complication during regular work hours, or they just want to see if like their alerts work or something like that, right? But obviously, as consultants, you are put into the position where you have to work outside of your normal work hours as well, right? If you are like a parent or you have other commitments, right, this may be very difficult. So you may have to decline that thing, or you may have to defer someone else to do it, right? Another question may be, can you remove XYZ from the report? Because they don't want the higher ups to see a certain vulnerability, right? It may be that they accidentally like left accounts that they should have deleted, and they're like, oh, we're going to delete those soon anyways. You can just take out that off the report. Ethically, is that okay to do, considering that you did find that at that time, and it is possible that a potential threat actor was also trying to, use the same things that you did at the same time that you did, or even earlier, right? Another tough question is, how is the client's security compared to other clients that you may have had, right? Well, there is private information, confidential information that you have in those contracts with each individual company, and you're not really supposed to, disclose that information to potentially their competitors, or really just in general. And if your client is really demanding, they're really trying to say, I really want to know how our security is compared to other companies. You're going to have to try to figure out and navigate that situation of how you may decline to answer that question respectfully. In addition to handling clients, you're also going to have to deal with their uptime, right? Some companies or clients that you may be asked to penetration test will have very, very critical services or servers that they are using for their own business operations. And you have to try to make sure that you are not inhibiting that, right? You have to really understand your techniques and every action that you do, right? So, for example, you may be trying to do a regular like Nmap scan on the client's network, and to most people, that's like a very logical thing to do. But if you don't understand how Nmap works, or the specific Nmap command that you ran, how that works, you may accidentally scan a part of their infrastructure that is very, very delicate. This actually happened to our CPTC team 3 years ago now, I believe, where we performed an Nmap scan on a dam for like a critical infrastructure organization, and that caused their dam like service, I guess, to actually crash. So the dam basically just let all the water out and it flooded the entire town. In this world, it basically like was responsible for killing like thousands of people. And now you, as the consultant, are the reason for that, which is obviously very, very bad. So you have to really understand like what you are doing and like the scope that it affects, because something as seemingly innocuous as just an MM scan could have very serious repercussions. So you don't want to clog the pipe where you just flood traffic, for example, and you cause potential denial of service, potential crashes, or just generally speaking, like slowing down the experience for other possible either employees or clients. You don't want to lock out accounts. You may be trying to get a domain administrator, and in the process of that, you lock out the domain administrator, right? That would be very bad, especially if you are doing this while the client's employees are trying to, go about their day and perform regular actions. You don't want to add new vulnerabilities to the environment if you can. Sometimes, again, depending on the specific contract that you hash out with the clients, they may be okay with you adding certain vulnerabilities. Like if you needed to add like a shell of some sort to the environment in order to actually get command execution, and that's stated to be okay as long as you report it, then that might be a situation where it works out. But if you don't have that clause, then you may just want to ask the client and say, is this something that is okay to do? And most importantly, you want to communicate with your point of contact with the client. If you're about to do something that you think might affect the uptime of their, business systems and infrastructure, then just let them know, contact them and say, hey, we're about to perform a, a test of some kind against some of your infrastructure. You may see, reduced performance in these systems, or this may cause a problem with this specific system, and you kind of give them the scope of which might be affected, and things like that, right? So you want to make sure that the uptime of your client's infrastructure is taken into consideration with all of your actions. Next up is objectives and scope. You want to make sure that you always are focused on the objectives given to you and highlighted by your contract. And you always want to make sure that you are staying in scope. You should never, ever, ever leave the scope, because as soon as you do, basically your contract is null and void, right? If you aren't able to stay in scope because you are highly suspicious of some potential either system or service or server or something like that, and you really think that there might be a potential vulnerability there, but it's out of scope, what should you do? You should ask the client, say, hey, I think that, this thing that is out of scope may put you at serious risk of some things. I have not tested it yet, but I would like to have our scope increased so that we can actually properly test it. And they may allow that, they may deny that. If they deny it, don't do anything. And make sure that you don't do anything before they explicitly give you permission to do so, to move forward with that, right? If you think like, oh, I'll just get, domain administrator real quick, and then I'll be able to prove to them that this should have been in scope in the first place, well, you may be getting a lawsuit, right? So that's much, much worse. And, another thing is you want to make sure that if you are performing some kind of like injection, for example, like cross-site scripting and things like that, that you aren't like causing other regular users to experience things like a bunch of alert pop-ups, right? Like that would not be ideal. So you want to make sure that what you're doing kind of, is unobtrusive as possible. All right, next we're going to be moving on to communication. So why should a client listen to you? It's because you are the expert. You are the one with all the technical expertise over these kinds of things that they hired you for, and they expect you to be knowledgeable, right? And they see things like a lack of confidence in the way that you speak or the way that you present yourself, or kind of like if your language is ambiguous and things like that, then they'll see that as you not really knowing your things. You may appear not to be an expert in your field, and you may think to yourself, well, I'm not an expert, but you got hired because they think you are, right? And that's why it's very important that you are very confident in the way that you either present yourself, you speak, or that you write, and you say things in a way that is stated as much as possible, as a fact, right? You try not to say, oh, this vulnerability may put you at risk. It may not put you at risk. I don't really know, right? You can't really say that if you're a consultant, right? You have to say, it will put you at risk of this. And then the client can then decide, oh, that risk is okay with us. Well, just ignore it. Or then they can say, oh, that's really, really bad. I need to address it, right? It is not your place as the consultant to try to assume what the client will respond with, right? You're here to provide facts. You're here to provide information so that your client can then make a decision themselves, right? You need to know your attacks, the theory behind those attacks, and the proper mitigations for those attacks. This kind of goes back into what we touched on earlier, but it really is important, right? Because when you are either writing a report or giving a presentation on what you did during the engagement, you need to basically be able to explain at various levels of technicality, like what you did, why that's a problem, and how to fix it or address it, right? So it's very important that you are able to know all of those things. But in some situations, you may not be able to account for everything. You may not be, a perfect person, and that's okay. But it is vitally important that you keep integrity and you admit when you do make a mistake or there are shortcomings in your engagement. For example, right, in the situation that I talked about earlier, where the previous CPTC team accidentally caused the dam to flood, the first thing you should do is, as soon as that happens and as soon as you recognize that, you tell your client, hey, I think we just crashed the dam system. You need to address that, right? Like the system is down. Or let's say you were unaware and then the client comes to you and they say, hey, did you like crash our dam server? Then you as the consultant need to be able to be aware of everything that your team is doing and be like, oh yeah, we did just scan your dam server. We weren't aware that it crashed, but it very well likely may have crashed due to our scan. And you work with the client based off of that, right? Don't try to lie. Don't try to kind of make it ambiguous. It's like, oh, it could have been us. It may not have been us, right? You try to just state the facts, right? You say we did scan and scanning may have caused that. And then you try to provide more information, right? Like you say, oh, we scanned at this time and the scan affected, these hosts. And then that way they can try to like correlate different kinds of activity and logs and things like that, right? While dealing with the situation. And if you don't have all of the answers, then it's perfectly okay to defer that to either a later time or to a different person. Because if you have your customer walk into a room and you happen to be like the web app penetration tester specialist, and they ask you about, oh, have you found any vulnerabilities in our domain? Then, don't try to answer that question if you can't, right? If you know someone else that can answer that question, you can defer to them and say, hey, I think that this question is better suited for so and so. Let me direct you to them. Or if it's something that you don't think that your team has information at all and you need time to like create the proper response, then just say, hey, I don't have the information about that right now. The team and I will try to figure out the situation and we'll get back to you later on with that kind of stuff. But again, most important thing, do not lie. Do not say that you found a vulnerability that you did not find. Don't say that you did not do activity that the client asked you about that you did do, things like that. These are all things that previous teams, not our team, but just previous teams like in CPTC in general, like the whole global competition, has had experience with. It is a very large part of the competition where they particularly find teams that may be in situations that would make them want to lie, and then they give them the opportunity to lie, to test you and see if you might actually lie, because it's very, very bad. And they're trying to teach you, do not lie. So next we're going to talk about reporting. And reporting is a very, very important part of both real life and CPTC, because for most situations, this is basically the sole deliverable that you're providing to the client. And in that case, then this is all you have to go to show for your engagement, right? It's very important that when you create these kinds of reports that you follow some kind of template. There are plenty of like previous years reports that were released, and you should be able to see them if you go to this link here, so you can type that in to your web browser. But basically, when you're writing these reports, right, it's very, very long. Like our report for CPTC last year for regionals was well over 100 pages, I think. And our report for globals was almost 100 pages as well, if not over 100 pages. And we had 1 day to write it for regionals and 2 days to write it for globals. So, you can't really expect to write 100 pages worth of content in less than 24 hours, right? Because part of that time is also you actually performing the penetration test. So you have to, use a kind of template that will also provide your report structure and consistency, but also it just saves you a lot of time, right? Some things you should usually have in a report are things like an executive summary, very high level overview. How did the engagement go? And a quick way to summarize the overall security posture that you have identified for the client, right? This being called the executive summary is meant for executives only, people who only have minutes of their day to understand everything that you did after, however long your engagement was, right? So that needs to be very, very concise. You'll also want to have an engagement summary. This is a little bit more broken down into detail. It might include things that you did kind of blocked by time. This can be a little bit longer. It's still a summary, so it shouldn't exceed really more than, like, I would say a page or two. But this is trying to summarize like kind of how the engagement went. more of a process-based way rather than just the results. You're also going to want to cover your methodology so that the client can understand the way that you approach things and the way or the reason why you found what you did using that methodology. That way, the client may ask you to use a different methodology in a future penetration test or things like that, or may just help them identify their own weaknesses in the future. You're also going to want to cover strategic strength, weaknesses, and recommendations that you may identify for the client. So if you find anything particular that, generally speaking, strategically speaking, that the client seems very good at, you want to call those out. You want to highlight what the client is doing well so they know that they need to keep doing that. Obviously, you're going to want to call any strategic weaknesses. You want to call out anything that you see is like repeated offenses, right? Things that seem to be a fundamental problem with how the client is handling their security. And then lastly, you also want to call out any strategic recommendations that kind of goes hand in hand with the weaknesses, how to like address those weaknesses basically. But again, those are more strategic. These are not like looking at any one particular vulnerability. These are high level, again, things that you're going to want to talk about so that the client can understand why they are, as vulnerable as they are, or potentially why they are not vulnerable, so they know what to continue. Then the most important thing I would say is probably the list of vulnerabilities here. These lists of vulnerabilities, or finding blocks as we like to call them, are basically the bread and butter of your report. It's going to be the longest section. And it's basically for every individual vulnerability that you find, you want to detail all of the, technical findings that you have. Things like what is the affected scope, things like what is the name of the vulnerability that you exploited, if it is a known vulnerability, or the category of vulnerability that might be if it's unknown, like it's a novel vulnerability. You're going to want to talk about things like how did you find it, and is it easily exploitable? You want to talk about things like what is the ramifications or the effect or the impact of that vulnerability to both the business as well as from a technical point of view. And you're also going to want to talk about the remediations. You want to actually tell the client what is your suggested way that they handle this. Again, they may not be able to accept your first choice, right? So it's important that you provide, maybe a list of potential remediations if applicable, right? If there's only one remediation, then you say there's only one remediation that you are aware of. But again, try to be considerate of the client in that sense where your first choice may not always be the only choice. And you want to present that, fact to them by giving them multiple, possibilities or suggestions. Some very important key tips as you are reporting, again, during the tryout process, you are going to be submitting a report, right? So this is very, very applicable to all of you trying out. You want to make sure that you are reporting as you go, right? You don't want to save the report for the very end. The way that tryouts and CPTC is structured, you have a lot of control with your time. But because of that, you are responsible for how you use that time, right? The number one thing that I have seen year over year, especially for tryouts, is that participants try to find every vulnerability they can, and they don't try to write the report very well. They try to just throw all the vulnerabilities together. It's kind of like a mess of different things. They're just, saying, I found this vulnerability, here's a screenshot or two, and they submit that. While it does tend to show that you have a lot of technical ability when you do it that way, the client doesn't get a lot of value from that because they don't really understand what they're reading. If you have things like typos or severe grammatical mistakes and things like that, where you don't provide enough screenshots, it's going to make your sole artifact of your engagement basically worthless. And again, if it's basically the only thing that you're submitting to them, unless you have like some kind of presentation or other things that happen like partway through, then the company or your client doesn't have any value from your engagement, and that's not good for you. So by reporting as you go, you're doing things like you're writing down notes about what you did, when you did them, any particular things that you are thinking about that vulnerability, like if you are thinking about a particular remediation or something like that, kind of jot that down as you are encountering these vulnerabilities, right? Do things like taking screenshots and things like that, and potentially start structuring or filling in some of your templated report. You don't have to do everything. You don't have to have a finished finding block as soon as you find a vulnerability, but kind of filling in some of the bare bones skeleton of a finding block so that you can then have more freedom to kind of use the later parts of the competition to just kind of fill in the blanks there, and connect everything together, since you know that you have everything instead of having to go back. Another thing is to understand technical writing. Inherently, the fact that you are here today shows that you have some technical ability, right? You have a decent technical understanding. Now you have to understand how to write about it. And the best way to learn how to write technically is to read technical documentation or technical things such as other pen test reports. So I highly recommend that you check out the repository for the previous year's CPTC reports. Again, it's there on screen, and you see how teams kind of write reports. My recommendation is that you look at a few different teams' reports and you see what are their strengths and what are their weaknesses, right? Some things may be as simple as, this report just looks way better. Like their color choices make more sense. Their use of tables makes more sense. The way that their finding blocks are formatted makes more sense. Or maybe it's other things like I really like how they have like a template for their findings. Like it makes it very easy to read. It makes it very easy for me to like predict what parts I need to go to if I'm looking for a particular piece of information about a particular thing. For example, if you specifically just care about the remediations, is that given in its own section, or is it somewhere in the middle of their finding block that they just talk about kind of willy-nilly, right? Or like flow of conscience kind of thing. So understanding technical writing, very, very important, and it's going to help you a lot during the tryout. And if you do have any questions about, potentially like things that you think may or may not be important, you could definitely reach out to us about that kind of thing, and we can kind of help you. But generally speaking, just looking at the previous year's reports are probably going to be your best friend, because that shows you what kinds of things people are actually kind of doing. And there's also a lot of like professional templates that you can look at as well. Those are a little bit harder to find, but they definitely exist. And we used some of those for our previous year's reports as well. So very, very useful information if you can go and find it. For findings, here's some more information about that. You want to make sure that you detail a finding if it affects the security posture of a client, and it is also capable of being remediated, right? If there is something that you just cannot fix, you have to seriously consider if that's something that you should put as a technical finding or perhaps as a strategic weakness. Like you have to figure out where that goes. Because if they have something that's not able to be remediated, it may fall under different categories, right? You want to make sure that you state the criticality of the findings that you do find, but it's important that you know that this is kind of up to your interpretation. There are different ways to rate criticality based off of some metrics. For example, there's CVSS, which is an attempt to kind of have a formula for mapping criticality. But at the end of the day, you are the technical expert. Criticality is a way of telling the client roughly in what order should they do these things, based off their criticality. Like, is it very, very severe, or is it low? The most important thing is that you recognize that this is up to your interpretation. You do have the freedom to say, based off of this environment, this vulnerability has a much more significant or much less significant risk associated with it, kind of thing. And also, again, you want to make sure you have remediations. You want to state things in a very, very clear way of how to actually address and fix the vulnerability if it exists, but do not make promises and do not trivialize the vulnerability or things like that, right? You want to take everything very, very seriously. And also don't try to exaggerate vulnerabilities. You want to just try to nail it really on the head. Either direction is not great. You just want to be as precise as possible. So here is a link for our regionals report from 2021. I highly recommend that you check it out. This scored, I believe, the top report in 2021 for our regionals. So it's a pretty good metric. Obviously, don't try to just copy it one for one. There's things that we didn't get 100%, right? But it's a good basis. So definitely try to check it out if you have the time. I'm going to move on to the next slide. So how do you actually perform technical writing? First piece of advice is be precise. I kind of talked about this roughly when I'm talking about remediations, but again, you want to really try to nail everything on the head. It is very difficult, but that's why you're getting paid, right? You're being paid because it is difficult to be precise, right? So you don't want to exaggerate things to be bigger than they are, but you also don't want to trivialize things to make them seem smaller than they are. You want to make sure that you're stating, whenever possible, only facts, right? Again, criticality is one of those things that is kind of up to your interpretation because it varies so significantly. There's so many factors that it's kind of hard to just only state facts for that. But yeah, you want to try to stay precise in most other things. You want to use tasteful uses of acronyms. So we have an example here where it says, X performed a penetration test against very secure networks, VSN. From here on out, we can then use VSN as an acronym. That way we don't have to make our writing much longer than it needs to be, right? Tasteful uses of acronyms can be a very powerful tool. You want to make sure that you are using consistent terminology, especially for things like exploit, vulnerability, finding, threat, risk, etc. These things, if you want to, you can make a section to particularly define how you will be using it in the report. But otherwise, you would definitely want to just make sure that you're using them consistently. All of these, by the way, exploit, vulnerability, finding, threat, and risk, have different meanings. They are not the same, right? So just be aware of that. You also wanted to make sure that verbs such as hacked or pwn or exploit are again used consistently. Be aware that things like just saying hacked or just saying pwn, while to us seems like everyday common sense just to use those words, but they are, generally speaking, not professional terms, right? You would want to try to stick with more professional and precise language, such as exploit, if applicable. You want to make sure that you are aware of your active versus passive voice, your style of writing. I know, you've probably heard this a lot in middle school and high school, but it is very important. The reason for this is because passive voice can be very confusing as a reader, right? You may not fully understand like the actual situation if written in the passive voice. The active voice is stating facts, right? So just as a brief refresher of what the active versus passive voice sounds like, the passive voice will have things happen to an object, right? Where the subject is kind of placed later. So you might say something like, the ball was thrown or something, versus I threw the ball, right? So you just want to be using the active voice at all times. Again, another thing is layman terms versus technical terms. Layman's terms are things that you may be talking internally with your team with, and that's fine. If you're giving like a presentation to executives, it may be better to use layman terms for that setting, but it needs to be a conscious choice each and every time that you use layman's terms versus technical terms. Again, it's highly dependent on your audience and who you're talking to or who it's for, or even what section it's in, right? If you're talking in the engagement summary, you may want to stick to layman's terms, but when you're in the finding blocks, you want to use technical terms, right? So again, just be very, very conscious with what you are writing and when or where you are writing it. The last section here we have presenting. Presenting, very, very important. You're gonna always want to have a few key points of your presentation that you have, just to make sure that you are, being professional. You want to start off with a proper greeting. You want to make sure you have an overview of what the presentation will contain. You want to make sure that you explain basically what happened in your engagement. That may vary depending on your audience. So for example, here we say like finding steps or methodology. It kind of depends on who you're talking to and what degree you may go into that. But you're definitely going to want to talk about strengths, weaknesses, recommendations, where that's basically trying to summarize your findings. So that's what you want to make sure you have. And then lastly, you want to make sure you are prepared for questions, because when they ask you a question and you just say, I don't know, over and over again, it's going to look bad. Even if you try to do it in the professional way that we talked about earlier, it will still look bad, right? You can't just, expect that you can kind of always defer every single question, because at that point, you are still going to look not like a source of information. You're not going to appear as an expert if you can't answer any of their questions, right? Just keep that in mind. There are times and places for everything that we've talked about. Some other thing that's very important is verbiage, which is just what you talk about, how you talk about it, and things like that. It's very important that you keep careful track of things like intonation and pacing and things. If you're the kind of person that tends to end every sentence with an upwards intonation, it may sound like you are kind of always asking a question, and you may not sound very confident in yourself, versus, being very, very like definitive in your statements where you say, this is how it is. This is a vulnerability, things like that. It gives that sense of confidence in your own statements, and that confidence is passed on to your client, and they have confidence in you and what you're saying. Generally speaking, gestures are also important. You can use a complete lack of gestures if you want to, and that's okay as long as you don't look too stiff. But, tasteful uses of gestures can also be a good aid when you're giving a presentation. But like I said, if you're not comfortable with giving gestures, as long as you don't look too stiff, you can just keep your hands at your side or something. But yeah, like I said, it's not just what you say, it's also how you look saying it. So if you are fidgeting, if you're staring at the ground, if you're muttering while you are giving a presentation, although everything you're saying may be true, it may be accurate, and it may be precise, if you don't look confident in what you're saying, if you don't look like an expert when you are saying it, it may not have the effect that you want, or it may leave a bad taste in your client's mouth, in the sense that they don't think that you are a serious consultant. And lastly, you can always just Google how to prepare for a presentation. There's a lot of good tips out there on the internet. I myself occasionally will look at different kinds of like speaking coaches and things like that. So I can also improve like how I speak and how I am while presenting. It makes a very big difference. And especially if you're the kind of person that feels very, very nervous when giving presentations, it can make a very substantial positive impact if you just do a little bit of presentation prepared work. Especially since the CPTC does have presentations. So keep that in mind. All right. So this week is a little bit shorter in terms of content of the slide deck, but that's because we want to give you ample time to kind of prepare for tryouts. So the homework slash lab portion of this week is going to be basically based off of your lab 4 and lab 5 environments, write up a template or an example report of the vulnerabilities that you found. You only need to do 3 finding blocks minimum, right? But if you want to do more, you definitely can. You can do it for extra practice, but we're only going to be grading 3. So that's going to be your Linux machines and the domain controller environment. The fictional client that you can use for the setting of this report will be a company called Nebula Technologies. They are a weapons manufacturing company. They have both private sector and government clientele, and base your business impact off of this information. So this information should affect how you rate the impacts or the criticality of the vulnerabilities that you find. You can DM Dylan if you have any questions about this stuff. And basically for the remainder of this current meeting, we're going to just be like answering like either questions, or it's kind of like a working session, where you can just kind of ask us about what either the template that you have or things like that. If you have questions about finding blocks or things like that. But other than that, it's kind of just a working session. So there's not going to be anything really due at the end of the lab, or so to speak. And then I'm going to cut the recording here and then answer the question in the Zoom chat.